A potential breakthrough in the deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II is now on the horizon, and it's happening without Ukraine at the table.
Here, the president posting on his social media account that he next Friday, August 15th, will be meeting face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Now, he had flirted with the idea of sitting down for a bilateral meeting with the Russian president here. This comes, we should note, today was supposed to be the deadline. There's an idea of a 10-day deadline that he had given Russia to go forward with a ceasefire and effectively bring an end to their aggression against Ukraine. At this hour here, there have been no clear sanctions or tariffs that have been imposed on Russia, but instead the president saying that he will go and meet with Putin, notably, whose name is not in that social media post, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. And we know that the Ukrainians had wanted to ensure that they, as part of any negotiation, were also had a seat at the table, that there would be no side agreement between the American president and the Russian president. So there's a lot of questions here over the next 7 days before that meeting.
So clear this up for me. If you have the answer, if you don't have the answer, I should say.
President Donald Trump announced Friday that he'll be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin next Friday in Alaska, with the meeting set for August 15th, 2025. But here's the bombshell. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has not yet been invited to attend. This isn't just another diplomatic meeting. This is the first face-to-face encounter between a U.S. president and Putin since 2021, the year before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of neighboring Ukraine. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the timing couldn't be more dramatic. So how did we get here? And why is this meeting happening now without the very country that's been fighting for its survival for over 3 years?
President Putin said this morning he was pretty dismissive of this idea of meeting with President Zelensky. President Putin was.
I don't know. I didn't
So for
hear
you
him.
to meet with him, he doesn't have to agree to meet with Zelensky. Is that what you're saying?
No, he doesn't. No.
So when do you think that meeting
They
will
would like to
happen?
meet with me, and I'll do whatever I can to stop the killings.
So obviously there, Jake, that is a notable comment when it comes to how quickly we could see this meeting come together. We first got word about it yesterday following that meeting between the special envoy and the Russian leader. And the White House said urgently and immediately the plans began to get underway for scheduling of some kind of meeting for this to happen. Where it would happen and how soon it could happen remains to be seen. The condition, the timeline that we were given was as soon as next week, but more likely within the next 2 weeks. Now, obviously, we'll see if that holds. And Jake, obviously, we're coming up against a critical deadline tomorrow where the president said he was going to put secondary sanctions in place as punishment for Russia continuing its war against Ukraine and not seeking a ceasefire or any kind of cessation in hostilities between the two of them. When the president was just asked whether or not that deadline still holds inside the Oval Office, he told another reporter that that remains to be up to Putin himself.
All right, fascinating stuff. Caitlin Collins at the White House, thanks so much.
To understand this seismic shift in global diplomacy, we need to rewind to Wednesday, August 6th, when everything changed. Movement toward a summit between Trump and Putin has accelerated rapidly since Wednesday, when Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff met with Putin for 3 hours in Moscow. This wasn't just a courtesy call. The Kremlin released a video showing Putin greeting Witkoff with a warm handshake and described the talks as useful and constructive. But here's where it gets interesting. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov said the American offer was deemed suitable after a day of internal review, marking a major diplomatic breakthrough. Think about that for a moment. After months of escalating tensions, sanctions, and military aid flowing to Ukraine, suddenly Russia is calling Trump's proposal acceptable. What exactly was in that proposal?
It legitimizes him. This man has been a pariah since February of 2022 when Russia committed unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. Now he's getting a meeting with the President of the United States to stand next to each other as equals and has to offer up nothing in return. That is the meeting right there as far as Putin's concerned. But I think he also wants to pull Trump back into his orbit. As you were saying, who's playing whom depends on kind of how you evaluate this. But I do think Putin now understands he may have pushed Trump a little bit further than he intended or than he wanted, and he needs to roll him back in.
While the full details remain classified, we're getting glimpses of what's on the table. Trump previewed terms of a potential peace deal to end the war in Ukraine that could include some swapping of territories. This is diplomatic speak for something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Ukraine potentially giving up land to Russia permanently.
newspaper published a definitive editorial saying no one should remain alive in Ukraine. So the idea of Ukrainian destruction is still part of the Russian conversation and debate, and there isn't really any evidence that they have withdrawn from that. I mean, I think the second thing to say is that the history of Russian negotiations, if you look at the previous negotiations in a previous era after the 2014 invasion, is that the Russians like to use negotiations to prolong things, to draw it out, to prevent sanctions, to prevent things from getting worse. And I worry that President Trump's team might, as Ambassador McFaul just said, might want some quick deal, and they will not see that this is part of Russia's longer strategy, which is maybe they would stop the war for a little bit, but which would be to start it again at some later time.
The Ukrainian response was swift and uncompromising. The answer to the Ukrainian territorial question is already in the Constitution of Ukraine. No one will retreat from this, and no one can. Ukrainians will not give their land to the occupier.
Years against the Russians. And it's not just the soldiers. The whole society is united and working and is tired. They do want an end to this war. There's no doubt about it. They don't want to give up territory. They know that these negotiations are possible that will give them a ceasefire. And then, as I say, then the discussions of these other things can happen. So the Ukrainians do want an end to the war, no doubt about that. That has increased, but that has to happen on a just and lasting peace.
Whenever you and I talk, I always ask you this question, but I do think it's so important for our viewers. Can you update us on what this war looks like right now on the ground? What is the reality of where this fighting stands?
The reality is on the ground that the Russians are grinding little bit by little
in a video
bit,
address Saturday morning. But here's the geopolitical chess game that's really unfolding. Trump's deadline for Russia to end its war in Ukraine or suffer severe economic punishment expired Friday. Yet instead of new sanctions, we're getting a summit announcement. This timing isn't coincidental, it's strategic. At the suggestion of the American side, an agreement in principle was made to hold a bilateral meeting at the highest level in the coming days. Putin's longtime foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, said, notice the phrasing, at the suggestion of the American side. This wasn't Putin begging for a meeting, this was Trump's team reaching out to Moscow. The choice of Alaska for this historic summit is laden with symbolism.
But the Russians have more.
The Kremlin's presidential aide, Yuri Ushakov, confirmed the meeting in Alaska, adding that it seems quite logical for such an important summit to take place in Alaska, with the Russian delegation simply flying over the Bering Strait. Alaska, once part of the Russian Empire until 1867, represents a neutral ground that doesn't favor either Washington or Moscow. But what about Ukraine's exclusion from these talks? This is where the diplomatic maneuvering gets really complex. Moscow all but dismissed Trump's proposal for a three-way summit involving Putin and Zelensky, with Ushakov saying the idea, for some reason, was mentioned by Washington yesterday but was not specifically discussed. Initially, the White House tried to make Ukraine's participation a condition. A White House official said Thursday afternoon that Trump would meet Putin only if Putin also agreed to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. But that position crumbled within hours. Hours later, however, Trump said Putin would not have to agree to meet with Zelensky before meeting with him.
Yes, good morning. Well, this is the Kremlin's ideal scenario, that they want to get Putin in a room with Trump, essentially alone without Zelensky, in order to influence the US on an outcome that will be favorable to Russia. And clearly, from a Ukrainian and European point of view, that would be very worrying indeed if Trump was willing to sit down with Putin to discuss an outcome in Ukraine that didn't include Ukraine, which of course is a very different position from his predecessor, Joe Biden, who famously said, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And in this situation, we'd have Putin and Trump sitting down together without Ukrainian presence, without a European presence to influence the US thinking, and Russia would be able to present its view of the war and the view of any settlement to that war. So that would be very much in Russia.
This reversal reveals something crucial about the power dynamics at play. Putin has consistently refused to treat Zelensky as an equal partner in negotiations. Putin has resisted any talk of a direct meeting with Zelensky, which would imply recognition of the Ukrainian leader as an equal, with Putin dismissing the idea by saying, For this to happen, certain conditions must be created. What are those conditions? Moscow continues to question Zelensky's legitimacy due to his refusal to hold new elections after his term expired, citing martial law. This is classic Putin, using legal technicalities to delegitimize his opponents while ignoring the obvious fact that countries don't typically hold elections during wartime invasions. The European reaction has been one of barely concealed alarm. European leaders have been distressed at the prospect that a summit could lead to Trump and Putin ganging up to impose terms on Ukraine. This fear isn't unfounded. Several European leaders spent Thursday on the phone with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky discussing how to approach the new diplomatic efforts. One senior European official captured the frustration perfectly. For all the bluster, Trump has not put a single iota of pressure on Putin, yet zero. Zip. This criticism stings because it highlights a fundamental question. Is Trump genuinely trying to end the war, or is he being played by Putin once again?
He said he could do it in 24 hours, but he's really focused a lot of attention, a lot of his own personal attention and that of his administration to this war. He wants to end the fighting. He wants to end the war. If he does, he's in line for a big prize. And that's the goal. So that's what's driving this right now.
A big prize. You don't mean that literally, I'm guessing, Ambassador. Nobel?
I do mean it literally. If he brings peace on a just and lasting basis that the Ukrainians can agree on, the Europeans can agree on, and there's justice and a lasting peace, sure.
The historical precedent here is deeply troubling. Trump and Putin's high-profile summit in July 2018 in Helsinki, Finland, when Trump sided with Putin over U.S. intelligence agencies, was one of the most controversial moments of Trump's first term and sparked days of White House cleanup. Putin may be banking on his capacity to manipulate Trump in a summit meeting, much as he was widely seen as doing when the two met in Helsinki in 2018, with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying that, for Moscow, the Helsinki talks were fabulous, better than super. But Trump's approach this time appears different in some ways. On Wednesday, he announced an additional 25% tariff on India to go into effect later this month as punishment for importing Russian oil. This shows Trump is willing to use economic pressure, just not directly on Russia itself. The military situation on the ground adds another layer of complexity to these diplomatic moves. The Kremlin believes Zelensky is now in a much weaker situation militarily and politically than in the spring because of Russia's gains on the battlefield. Russia analysts said Putin is convinced he is winning the war and can achieve his goal of subjugating Ukraine, stripping it of its military and its capacity to defend itself and blocking it from joining NATO. This confidence may explain why Putin is suddenly willing to engage. He's not negotiating from weakness, he believes he's negotiating from strength. Russia controls around a fifth of Ukraine's sovereign territory, while Ukraine controls only a small toehold in Russia's western Kursk region. Russia has repeatedly demanded that Kyiv withdraw from several of the Ukrainian regions that Russia only partially controls, a demand that Ukraine categorically refuses. The potential terms being discussed reveal just how far apart the sides remain. Previous proposals have been telling. In April, Europe and Ukraine had opposed a Witkoff proposal that included a full lifting of U.S. economic sanctions on Russia, neutrality for Ukraine, and recognition of the territory Russia had already seized in return for a freezing of the conflict at the current front line. Those terms failed to provide Ukraine with any adequate security guarantees and would allow Russia to return and take more territory later. Zelensky's constitutional constraints add another complication to any potential deal. Such concessions are against the Ukrainian constitution, meaning Zelensky would need to first get permission from parliament or a national referendum before agreeing to any shift in territory. Trump on Friday downplayed those concerns, saying he'd urged Zelensky to smooth the path toward an agreement, with Trump saying he's going out and getting what he needs. But Zelensky's latest statements suggest he's not budging. Zelensky appeared to express opposition to such ideas in a statement posted on social media early Saturday, saying Ukrainians would not gift their land to the occupier, and that peace deals reached without Ukraine were stillborn and unworkable. The broader geopolitical implications of this summit extend far beyond Ukraine. China is glad to see Russia and the United States maintain contact, improve their relations, and advance the political resolution of the Ukraine crisis, Xi told Putin in a phone call held at the latter's request. Beijing sees an opportunity here to position itself as a peace broker while potentially weakening Western unity. The timing of this summit also coincides with other global pressures. The complications of applying new sanctions on Moscow while simultaneously preparing for potential talks with Putin only underscored the uncertain moment for the war in Ukraine. Trump is trying to balance multiple competing priorities: his desire to be seen as a peacemaker, pressure from Congress for tougher Russia sanctions, and the need to maintain alliance relationships with Europe. What makes the situation particularly precarious is that both Trump and Putin have massive egos and domestic political considerations at play. Trump's boiling frustration with Putin, who has tarnished the president's hopes of becoming a peacemaker, worthy of the Nobel Prize, evaporated after his envoy, Steve Witkoff, emerged from a 3-hour meeting Wednesday with the Kremlin strongman. For Putin, this summit represents validation of his strategy of outlasting Western resolve. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov downplayed Trump's threat to impose penalties by Friday, saying Russia's economy had grown largely immune to Western pressure following more than 3 years of sanctions. The Ukrainian perspective on being excluded from these crucial talks is one of deep concern and historical déjà vu. Ukraine has in the past reacted with alarm to the prospect of being excluded from Russian-American negotiations about its own fate. After representatives from Washington and Moscow held talks in Istanbul in February, Zelensky lamented that once again, decisions about Ukraine are being made without Ukraine. But Zelensky is also trying to project strength despite his exclusion. Ukraine is not afraid of meetings and expects the same brave approach from the Russian side, he wrote in a post on X. It is time we ended the war. The European allies are now in a difficult position. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer spoke with Zelensky by phone on Saturday morning and agreed that we must keep up the pressure on Putin to end his illegal war. Zelensky said he spoke with French President Emmanuel Macron and another key ally and said that he was grateful for the support, adding, "It is truly important that the Russians do not succeed in deceiving anyone again." The question of what Putin might offer Trump in Alaska remains the biggest unknown. Ushakov revealed Russia has already invited Trump for a follow-up meeting in Russia. This suggests Putin is thinking beyond just one meeting. He's planning a diplomatic courtship designed to gradually separate Trump from his European allies and Ukrainian partners. Trump himself admitted he doesn't know what Putin's game is, telling reporters, "I can't answer that question yet. I'll tell you in a matter of weeks, maybe less." This admission of uncertainty from a president who typically projects absolute confidence suggests even Trump recognizes the risks he's taking. The stakes of this Alaska summit cannot be overstated. If Trump somehow did manage to initiate a genuine peace process, he'd save potentially thousands of lives in a war that has devastated Ukrainian civilians. He'd also achieve a major milestone for the U.S. and himself. But the flip side is equally dramatic. Putin could be stringing Trump along again after meeting Witkoff, whose record on peacemaking in the Middle East and Ukraine is threadbare. What happens next will depend largely on whether Trump can resist Putin's legendary ability to manipulate world leaders in personal encounters. President Ronald Reagan's Cold War maxim about dealing with Moscow, "Trust but verify," seems quaint given Putin's record of duplicity over the war. Zelensky had a more apt forewarning. The key is to ensure they don't deceive anyone in the details, neither us nor the United States. The Alaska summit represents either the beginning of the end of Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II, or the beginning of a new phase where Ukraine finds itself increasingly isolated and pressured to accept terms that could spell its doom as an independent nation. With Zelensky excluded from the table where his country's fate may be decided, the world is about to witness whether Trump can succeed where others have failed, or whether he's about to hand Putin his greatest diplomatic victory yet. One thing is certain, August 15th in Alaska will be remembered as either a historic breakthrough for peace, or the day Ukraine was sold out by its most PR-powerful ally. The entire world will be watching,